Now, looking at the rubric, really we want to look at these top parts, required components. That was the whole thing of I looked through and pretty much they were there. Calculations, okay, are the calculations there present and correct? Yeah, the calculation, we got to go down here, and those are just a bunch of tables. Now, they did generate data, but it looked like that was even correct, so that's good. The box plots, they needed means and medians, and maxes and mins, and that all looked correct. This table looks good. Now, they never showed any sort of scatter plots, which, depending on how many variables you're doing and so forth. But I think they really should have shown something with scatter plots. However, I will say that a box plot, really, if these were over the 4 different cases, you would have had data inside those boxes, a bunch of dots inside there. And so that's kind of like a scatter plot, and so that's okay. But anyway, calculation, that looks good, and they talked about those. Let's see. So yeah, calculations look pretty good, present and correct. So they probably got all 4 points on their calculations. Appropriate mathematical symbology. Well, they talked about a null hypothesis back here somewhere. I think that was in the interpretation. They mentioned the null hypothesis. They said alpha level. Now, actually, it would have been nice if they would have used mathematical notation of a Greek alpha. I know Word, you can put in Greek letters like alpha in there, and you can put in an equal sign and that sort of thing. That's nice mathematical notation. The null hypothesis, they mentioned that somewhere of no difference. And, well, hey, write out H0, colon, just like I do in stuff I give you, and HA, colon, and so forth. And, so they could have a little better mathematical notation, but on the whole, it's pretty good. Okay, the box plots look good and so forth. So, their mathematical symbology and so forth, probably a 3. Not quite a 4, but probably a 3. Assumptions stated. Okay, now there, some of your assumptions come in the confounding variables. Okay, so they mention that pretty nicely. Now they could have said more about those confounding variables, and and justified that better. But yeah, that wasn't bad. That was pretty good if you remember what we talked about there. And then though, now on the regression here, well, there are some assumptions about the variance of the different variables, and what the plots would look like, and as far as not when you think of a trend line for regression, you shouldn't see like funnel shaped dots or something like that, as in narrow toward one side and very wide toward the other. In other words, the variance is changing with the x variable. That it's assumed that doesn't happen, and the assumptions of the particular statistical test weren't really mentioned. Well, but of course the reasons for choosing the statistical test, remember, weren't really mentioned. And so they get hit a little bit on their assumptions, because again, the confounding variables a little weak on that, and then on the statistical test they didn't talk about that at all as far as what the assumptions were, anything there, and so probably a 2 on that. The mathematics explained. you know, the box plots explained and other things. You know, was this explained? Yeah, actually, I think they did a pretty good job with the t-table. You know, they mentioned the slopes. Now, they aren't labeled here, so that might have been nice. But they did mention the slopes. They never mentioned standard error. That might have been good to mention. But they you know, got the p-values and so forth. So that was pretty good. Again, they gave tables to talk about where these box plots came from, so that was good. You know, they mentioned the alpha and that the p-values were bigger than their alpha, so again, that's good explanation. So, you know, I think they did a pretty good job of explaining the mathematical representations of things, you know, what stuff meant. They did pretty well on that. Possibly not quite a 4, maybe just a 3, but you know, somewhere 3 or 4. It was pretty good. Possible conclusions explained. Definitely, I think they interpreted things nicely. Those conclusions were very nice here, and kind of how it impacted somebody else. Now, they didn't really readdress, though, you know, the population and who this could be applied to. You know, is this any sport, any college? They didn't come back to that, and so they're a little weak on that, on the conclusions explained. Because again, those conclusions really should be applied to what population, okay? You know, is it really all college students? You know, because again, they didn't even look at college students with an ACT below 24. So really all college students? So their interpretation was good of the calculations, but their explanation of their conclusions was a little weak. So, you know, probably more like a 3 there. Now, so notice, you know, required components, they were near a 6, probably like a 5.5 or something. I might even gone with a 6 with just that one thing missing, because I tend to like whole numbers, and going to a 5 seems like that would be a little rough. Calculations, I think we said were good, so 6 and 4, there's, you know, 10. Symbols, I think we went down to a 3, and assumptions a 2. You know, so out of possible points, we're missing 3 points so far to there. Mathematics explained, I thought they did a nice job, and I said 3 or 4. Let's go with let's say a 4, so they're still down just 3 points. Possible conclusions, again, you know, that it matters, you know, what can you apply this, you know, what population does this extend to, and so forth. So I think really maybe a 2 there. So we're down maybe as many as 5 points, and then finally how and their flow and grammar and so forth, I think was fine. That was very good. I saw a couple typos and so forth, but that was fine. So they didn't lose any points here. It's very readable. That was nice. Data and computational results support the conclusions. There, I think they did a very nice job there as well. Again, you know, they mentioned the p-values and all that. You know, I think where they were weak were more in the assumptions and so forth. You know, with those confounding variables and what the assumptions of the test were. You know, and they never really showed us those data to show they looked like they fit the assumptions okay. So they could have had a few more plots and all that. But I would say that was more under the assumptions and the possible conclusions, not so much under how data and computational results support the conclusions. I think they did a nice job of talking about that support. So probably, again, probably full credit there. So they missed about 5 points out of everything except the slides. So that means they got 30 out of 35 points. And, so if they did great on their presentation, which actually, if I recall, they did, let's say they just nailed their presentation. I mean, the slides were very clear and concise, and and it looked professional and all that. That means it sounds like I would have gone with about a 35 out of 40. And what is that? Well, that means you take, basically, to get a percent, you'd multiply that 35 by about 2.5. And so that's like 87.5%. That's an A-. Okay? So this paper, and again, I said, well, maybe a 4, maybe a 3, and then I went up to the 4 in one of these places or something. So with missing, say they missed 5 points, that was an A-. So you'd be looking at an A- here. If I was, again, it's more about the points than the letter grade itself, because it's the points that go into the average. But had it been 6 off, well, that would have been, and they still did great on the slides. Or maybe it was 5 off and they had some problem on the slides or something. Say, so instead of a 35, it was 34. Well, let's see, 34, that's 68 is twice, and another 17 is 85. So that's a nice B+ there. And and that's what I had said. If I recalled, this paper was like a high B, or maybe a low A, a B+, A-. But it was somewhere in the high 80s, I think. And as I look at this and talk about it, yeah, it looks like it probably was. So it gives you an idea of what it takes to be pretty good. I think something in the high 80s or above, certainly 85 or higher, that's pretty good. I think you've done a nice job on the final project. If you are in the 90s, man, that's fantastic. And mid 70s isn't bad. I mean, it's passable. I mean, by definition, right? And so, but this gives you an idea. So if you were thinking you could turn in a page and get an A-, no. Just look at this example, right? I mean, this is, at best, this was an A- paper. And at worst, it was probably a B+, probably not a B, although maybe, I mean, if I took, again, a lot of that depended on them having great slides, I mean, a good, clean presentation. So if their presentation wasn't really clean, just kind of clean, they only got a 4. And if I had decided on, I think a couple places up here I went, let's go with a 4 as opposed to a 3. If I'd gone with that 3, they could have been as low as a B, but no lower than a B. So again, looking at how I kind of apply these rubrics, that's how you want to think about your paper. And you can always go back to theirs and go back to this video and see, what did I seem pretty happy with of theirs, what wasn't I happy with, and you can try to put those together to make a really spiffy final project. So we'll call that good for the rubric.